Uncover how to reduce your suffering by hacking your mind. From the Buddha to Freud, students of human nature have often noted a paradox in our behavior. No one chooses to suffer, yet most of us cling to our suffering. We know what we do makes us unhappy, yet we continue doing it. Freud attributed this tendency to the unconscious and irrational drivers within our psyches, the saboteurs of our conscious, rational selves. In contrast, Buddhists don't need to identify hidden agents of unhappiness. For them, the very act of thinking is enough to trap us in suffering. Buddhists make a clear distinction between pain and suffering. Pain is unavoidable. Terrible things that cause us real pain happen all the time. However, suffering isn't caused by the disappointments and losses the world imposes on us. It's a product of our thinking. When we interpret what happens to us through angry, resentful, self-hating, and anxious patterns of thought, we prolong and intensify pain. We choose to suffer. Surprisingly, breaking this pattern is about something other than positive thinking. It's about suspending automatic thinking and allowing thoughts to simply be without subjecting them to endless loops of interpretation. When we learn to do that, we not only suffer less, but we also unlock our full potential. Sounds lovely, right? Let's explore how you can achieve this more peaceful state of mind. We shape our reality through our thoughts. Let's start with a timeless question. What is heaven and what is hell? Some religious traditions interpret these concepts literally. For example, many Christians and Muslims view heaven and hell as real places of either absolute goodness or eternal suffering. Most Buddhists, however, conceptualize them figuratively and psychologically. For them, heaven and hell are states of mind, not locations. An old parable from Buddhism illustrates this idea. It goes like this. One day, an intense and burly battle-scarred warrior visited a Buddhist master. He found the master meditating in his garden. The warrior, accustomed to issuing commands rather than engaging in philosophical discourse, crudely interrupted the master and demanded an answer to his question. What is heaven and what is hell? He boomed with his deep and commanding voice. The master calmly peeked open his eyes and looked up at the warrior. Why should I tell a rude brute like you, a man who makes demands rather than ask politely? The master said before closing his eyes again. The warrior was taken aback. Men of his class were used to being treated with deference and were known to punish anyone who disrespected them brutally. Outraged, the warrior raised his sword over the master's head. But the master neither flinched nor begged for mercy. He simply and softly said, "That is hell." The warrior froze. He instantly understood the master's meaning. Anger, resentment, and entitlement had consumed him. For nothing but an inconsequential wound to his ego, he had been ready to kill this man. He sheathed his sword, placed his palms together, and bowed in gratitude for the master's insight. A smile flickered across the master's face as he said, "And that is heaven." What can this parable teach us? It can be argued that we experience reality through our thoughts. The objective world doesn't cause us to perceive things in a particular light. It's our internal thought processes that shape our perceptions of the world. In other words, we create our reality, good or bad, through thought. As the 17th century English poet John Milton put it, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. That's precisely what the master teaches the warrior. The hell the warrior experiences isn't caused by anything in the world. It's self-created, a product of his ego. Heaven, too, is an internal state of mind. He experiences it when he lets go of his ego. In other words, we live through our perception of reality, not reality itself. On this basis, reality is nothing but a series of events occurring independently of thought. There is nothing good or bad, as Shakespeare's Hamlet tells us, but thinking makes it so. Whether we feel positively or negatively about something tells us little about the nature of that thing but it tells us a great deal about our interpretive methods. Of course, it's natural to interpret certain things in specific ways. For instance, it would be odd to claim that sadness was an inappropriate interpretation of reality if a loved one died. But we don't only suffer for understandable reasons. If that were the case, we wouldn't need sages like the Buddha or analysts of human psychology like Freud. We do need them, though, because we are often the authors of our needless suffering. But this type of suffering can be cured. After all, if thinking creates our reality, it stands to reason that we can change our experience of reality by changing our thinking. And if that's true, we're only one thought away from making our own heaven out of hell. Thinking helps us to survive, not thrive. Before we get to the cure, let's talk about the diagnosis. How does thinking cause suffering? To answer that, we need to take a brief detour through the evolution of our species. Evolution equipped humans with large brains capable of rationalizing, analyzing, and thinking for a good reason. It helped us survive. Thought, in short, is a defense mechanism. Our brains are programmed to scan our surroundings for potential dangers and excel at this task. Our minds analyze the world in front of us, dredge through memories of past experiences, and generate predictions about the future. So far, so rational. The problem is, our brains were designed for a world in which threats to life and limb lurked behind every bush. But the world has changed. We don't need to hunt dangerous animals or take chances with potentially deadly berries to avoid starvation. Most of us have credit cards and access to well-stocked supermarkets. Our neighbors are more likely to annoy us with loud music than to kill us. A broken leg was once a death sentence. Today, it's an inconvenience. Our surroundings are much less dangerous now than in the past. Evolution plays out over millions of years, and our brains have yet to catch up with the miraculous advances humanity has made over the centuries. Our bodies live in the information age, but our brains are prehistoric. Adrenaline-charged preparedness for fight or flight made sense in the distant past, but it mostly doesn't today. Our minds don't know that, so we continue scanning crime-free suburbs, comfortable offices, and annoying neighbors for existential threats. This tendency takes the form of constant, automatic, anxious thinking. Our danger-obsessed lizard brains cause us to overthink what to wear or eat, ruminate over old conversations, and fret about how we said or did was perceived. They're the reason we second-guess colleagues and bosses, endlessly redraft emails, and convince ourselves minor health symptoms are premonitions of impending death. Worst of all, they make us replay past events on an endless loop, refreshing and prolonging the pain they caused us. This is a recipe for suffering. From a Buddhist perspective, the diagnosis is clear. Much of our misery is caused by our attachment to thought patterns, which brings us back to the cure. How can we end this needless suffering? The answer, as we'll see, is to stop thinking. Thoughts create. Thinking destroys. Thoughts are nouns. They're something you have, not something you do. They're effortless and spontaneous. They simply happen. Thinking, on the other hand, is a verb. It's something you do. Essentially, it's the act of thinking about your thoughts. Thinking is energy-intensive, requiring effort and willpower, both finite resources. Let's try a little thought experiment to make this distinction easier to grasp. All you have to do is name your dream annual income. Don't overthink it. Just let the number appear in your mind. Got it? Okay, now multiply it by 5. Notice anything? If you're like most folks, the first number popped into your mind without much prompting. Chances are, it felt good. You might have experienced a little rush of exhilaration. The second number was probably different, though. Did you suddenly find yourself worrying and fretting? Did you question how you could earn that much money, or whether you deserve to? If you answer yes, you've just experienced the transition from thought to thinking. As you can see, the latter is an emotional roller coaster. It hurls you onto the crest of anxiety and anger and plunges you into the depths of self-doubt, guilt, and unworthiness. So, what does this little thought experiment tell us? Simply put, thinking about thoughts, not the thoughts themselves, is at the root of psychological suffering. Thoughts are simple and easy. They require no great effort and trigger little resistance. But things go wrong when you start to process and judge those thoughts. But here's the thing. You don't have to engage with your thoughts, you don't have to think about them, and you don't have to judge them. Thoughts are creative and upbeat. They tell you what you truly desire and care about. Thinking is neither of those things. In fact, it's downright destructive and damaging. As soon as you start thinking, you cast your limited beliefs, judgments, criticisms, programming, and conditioning onto your thoughts. The question is, how can you stop negative programming from tarnishing your thoughts? The first step, as always, is recognition. Since you only feel what you're thinking, feelings are like an internal dashboard, telling you whether you're in your head. If you're experiencing many negative emotions, you may be overthinking things. Let's look at what you can do when you are stuck in this loop. We achieve mental clarity when we stop trying to do things with our thoughts. If thinking causes suffering, shouldn't we stop thinking? That, though, is an odd notion. Can we stop doing something that our brains are biologically hardwired to do? The short answer is yes. Let's wrap things up by unpacking the more extended version. First, let's define our terms. To stop thinking isn't the same as stopping thoughts in general. As we've seen, thoughts and thinking aren't synonymous. We're working towards a state of mind in which thoughts flow through us with no resistance. In other words, to stop thinking is to stop thinking about and judging thoughts. This isn't a specific action. Really, it's the absence of action. The more we become conscious of the fact that thinking causes us to suffer, the easier it becomes to detach ourselves from that thinking. An analogy can help us grasp the meaning of this idea. Imagine you're given a bowl of murky water from a puddle. Your task is to make the water clear. There are lots of ways to solve this problem. For example, you could boil the water or pass it through a coffee filter. These kinds of solutions are active. They're about doing something to the water, but there's a more straightforward solution. Leave the water alone. Given enough time, the dirt will settle at the bottom of the bowl, and the water will clear itself. The mind works in this way, too. We often try to boil or filter out thoughts actively. In other words, we try to do something with them. That is what thinking is. But if we leave them alone, thoughts settle down on their own. Just as undisturbed water tends towards clarity, so do our minds. The key is to avoid agitation. In Japanese culture, this phenomenon has its word, mushin. It describes a mental state in which the mind is freed from anger, fear, random thoughts, and, most importantly, ego. Typically, it represents a martial artist's state of mind during combat, but it also applies to other areas of life. When mushin is achieved, the practitioner can react to what's in front of her without hesitation. Rather than getting lost in rambling thoughts or self-doubt, she draws on her training and intuition to act quickly and decisively. In Western contexts, we often use the concept of flow state to describe the mental clarity we achieve when we're completely absorbed in a task. Both flow state and mushin are about being purely present at the moment. Our brains aren't shut off. On the contrary, we are usually at our most creative and innovative when we achieve such states. That's because we're not thinking, but instead letting thoughts flow through us. Thinking hinders performance in all areas of life. Hesitation, reluctance, doubt, insecurity, and fear are the byproducts of thinking. By contrast, we're at our best when we enter a state of non-thinking. When we stop thinking, we free ourselves from the ego's limitations and become capable of living up to our full potential. Our brains have evolved to overthink. Without minds capable of constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of danger, our species wouldn't have made it as far as we have. But in today's safer world, this ability leads to needless suffering. If we want to escape that suffering, we must stop believing everything we think. To do that, we must allow thoughts to pass through our minds without judgment or resistance. Japanese culture calls this state of mind mushin. Western culture often calls it a flow state. Both describe a state of liberated non-thinking that frees us from suffering and allows us to unlock our true potential. I encourage you to share your thoughts below and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay up to date with our future videos on this and other fascinating topics that can help with cultivating a better daily mindset.